So, in point 4, I would argue that it's very possible, very probable even, that Moses used a number of sources in composing the Pentateuch, sources that were handed down orally or written that he had available to him. But the locus of inspiration, the process of inspiration, was when Moses himself was actually putting this together. These sources may or may not have been inspired by God, but Moses, as the author of the final form of the Pentateuch, certainly was. Now, when I talk about these sources, I'm not referring to what has come to be known in classical scholarship over the last 250 years or so as source criticism. Sometimes you see it as source analysis. It's often called the documentary hypothesis. And your textbook has a whole good section on that, so I'm not going to repeat all the arguments there. But I do want to just kind of review what that is and what that what the nature of this is, and make a couple comments about that. The documentary hypothesis, or source criticism, received its classical expression by Julius Wellhausen. Writing in the 1860s. This had been developing over some time, but Wellhausen gave it its classical formulation, and it's often known also by its the letters assigned to the different hypothetical sources as the JEDP theory. The JEDP theory. All of these are essentially synonyms: source criticism, documentary hypothesis, JEDP theory. What is it? Where does it get its name, the documentary hypothesis or JEDP theory? Well, the idea is, it originally comes from the observation, probably a scholar named Wilhelm de Wette, in 1703, made the observation that in Genesis 1 and 2, we have two parallel accounts of creation, and that in Genesis 1, God is referred to as God. And the Hebrew term for God is Elohim. And it begins with an E. Whereas in Genesis 2, in Genesis 1, he is referred to consistently only as God, or as Elohim, not anything else. Genesis 2, which speaks about, Genesis 1 speaking about the creation of the cosmos, Genesis 2 speaking about the creation of humans, consistently all the way through there, God is referred to as the Lord God, or Jehovah God, or Yahweh Elohim. And Yahweh is the personal name of God. And in English, the letter here is Y. In German, the J sounds like a Y, so it was written as Yahweh in German. And so that's the J of the JEDP theory. There's the J and the E. So de Wette was the first one to notice that a couple different names of God used in Genesis 1 and 2. And de Wette postulated that Moses may have used two different sources. One, cosmic creation using Elohim. One using creation of humans using Yahweh Elohim, which makes sense in one level because the creation of humans is a much more intimate picture of creation. Yahweh Elohim, the term Yahweh or the term Jehovah, is what got revealed to Moses at the burning bush as the personal covenantal name of God, of the God of Israel. So there's this more personal dimension to that name. De Wette believed in Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch, but he was suggesting that maybe there was a couple different sources that he may have used. Well, this developed over 150 years or so into what came to be known as the documentary hypothesis, given its classical formulation by Wellhausen, as we said. So what did Wellhausen present? He argued that there was a J document called the Yahwistic document, and it presented a unified picture of Israel through all the strands of the Pentateuch where you find the Lord referred to as the Lord, Yahweh. And any place that you see that would have been composed by an author. And the date for this document is usually the 10th or 9th century BC. In other words, the time of Solomon or after. In other words, many hundreds of years after Moses. This is the 900s, 800s BC. If we have Moses at 1400 BC, we were talking about 500 or 600 years later. In other words, this whole theory severs any connection between Moses and the Pentateuch as a document. So it essentially denies Mosaic authorship. Wellhausen proposed that the Elohistic, the E document was the Elohistic document, and where God is referred to as Elohim, that would be the E document. That's usually seen about 100 years later, so the 8th century BC, or the late 9th century BC. The D document is seen as the book of Deuteronomy. And this comes from the passage in 2 Kings, chapters 22 and 23. This comes, the designation of this document and the dating of this document come from the story in 2 Kings 22 and 23, where it's the story of King Josiah. King Josiah was one of the good kings late in Judah's history, and he was king from around 640 BC down to about 609 BC. And he was one of the kings that undertook to repair the temple. And in the year 621, he undertook to have the temple repaired. And we read in 2 Kings 22 that as they were repairing the temple, they discovered in the temple a copy of the Book of the Law. So they brought it out, they read it, and they discovered that all kinds of things in the Book of the Law that were supposed to be having been done, they were not doing. They had been not practiced in Israel. So they became alarmed about this. They went to the prophetess Huldah and asked her for her thoughts, and she said, "You should do this." So they instituted a whole series of reforms based upon what they read in the Book of the Law. And they cut down all the altars to other gods. They removed all the high places. They centralized the worship in Jerusalem. They celebrated the Passover. And they did a whole bunch of other things that the Book of the Law mandated. Now, comparing the reforms here in 2 Kings 22 and 23 with the Book of Deuteronomy, we find that most of what's there is found in the Book of Deuteronomy. So Wellhausen and others earlier actually proposed that it wasn't the whole book of the law, it wasn't the entire corpus of the law or the Pentateuch, but rather it was the book of Deuteronomy that was found in the temple. Most evangelicals don't have any problem with that, and it may well have been. We don't really know. It's just a guess as to what was the content of the book of the law found. It could have been the whole Pentateuch, could have been the legal parts of the Pentateuch, or it could have been Deuteronomy. I don't really. There's nothing really at stake one way or the other. There, we can go either way on that one. However, where pretty much every evangelical would part ways from the critical theory that we're describing here is the next step, which Wellhausen and others have argued that this book of the law, it was Deuteronomy, was not an old copy of Deuteronomy that had been there for centuries. Rather, it was a new copy that was written at this very time. Immediately prior to this, someone who was concerned about the apostasy and the general spiritual decline in Israel, in Judah, had written this up, planted it in the temple, and when it was assigned Moses to it to give it sort of the authority of a great name from antiquity. And when it was discovered, voila, here's this supposedly ancient book that was discovered. But really, we know, say the scholars, it was written around 621, right before that, whenever. You will often see the term pious fraud. often see the term pious fraud associated with this. In other words, that what this was it was a pious book, but it was fraudulent in the sense that it was not really written by Moses. Most evangelicals basically would say, well, that is going too far. There's nothing that really would necessitate dating this to that later period. There's nothing that would say, well, why don't we just read the text in a straightforward fashion and say that it was an old scroll that had been there for many decades, if not centuries, and it very well could have been the book of Deuteronomy or the Pentateuch, and discovered at a later time. But anyway, that's the D of the documentary hypothesis, and the P is what's often called the priestly document, and this is dated to the 5th century BC. In other words, or the late 6th century. In other words, the time of the exile, 500s, and into the 400s, the 5th century BC. Time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Many would argue that Ezra, the scribe, was one who kind of brought all of this together at the end of the Old Testament period. But the priestly document would be all the portions of the Pentateuch, certainly all of Leviticus, for example, all the last half of Exodus, chapters 20 to the end, portions of the book of Numbers, most of the book of Deuteronomy, at least in the body of the book. All of those sections of the law that have to do with stuff that the priests would be interested in. The ceremonies, the festivals, the sacrifices, the lists, the numbers, kind of the things that a button-down mind of a priest, according to the scholars, would be interested in. All of that is part of the P document at the end. So this is the classic documentary hypothesis presented, given its classic expression by Wellhausen, 1860s. It survived into the modern day in various forms. Longman and Dillard give you more detail about the ins and outs of how it's fared in the scholarly community. There are many different approaches now to the Pentateuch, speaking more of a unitary approach, but it's still alive and kicking. It's still sort of the dominant presupposition in the academy. It's still the dominant presupposition in non-evangelical schools. Evangelicals essentially don't buy it, partly because of the evidence to the contrary of Mosaic authorship, or Mosaic certainly has fingers all the way through the Pentateuch in terms of writing things down. But beyond that, it seems to me it's requiring us to believe in something or to accept, something that there's no specific evidence for. There's no reference anywhere in the Bible itself, or rabbinic literature, or New Testament to a J document, or an E document, or a P document. And so to think, as Wellhausen did, that someone sat down and wrote this masterpiece of weaving together the parts of the Pentateuch with the J, and there would be no trace of it anywhere, no references to it anywhere, it seems to me stretches the imagination. It also does not allow for doublets. In other words, part of the theory which say that when you have duplication of names or duplication of stories, or similar stories, that they're really the same story or the same person, same name, but written by two different authors, and they kind of were spliced together. So you have a picture of the Pentateuch written this way, the J document kind of winding its way through, the E document winding its way through, the P the same way. Then you have D, Deuteronomy, here, and it's actually extended, the three documents, into the book of Joshua by most scholars. But this kind of interweaving of things, to me, stretches the imagination, and I'm not convinced of it for a lot of reasons. So that's a real short introduction to the documentary hypothesis, sometimes called source criticism. And getting back to the main point of the lecture here now, I think it's very plausible that Moses may have used sources in writing the Pentateuch. But when I use the word sources, I'm not talking about this particular brand of source criticism. I'm talking about sources that may have actually been written that he could have maybe used. We don't have evidence for that except for the one reference to the book of the words of the Lord. So it's a guess. But I don't think our doctrine of inspiration would suffer if we think of Moses actually writing using different sources. That would be also some evidence for, again, Moses maybe not writing every last word. Finally, we'll just make references to the possibility of late glosses. In other words, late additions, late by someone else looking back and adding or tweaking some of the wording. And, for example, in Genesis 12 and 13, there are a couple references to the time of Abraham now, a reference to something to the effect of, at that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Well, what's the significance of that? Well, we know that when hundreds of years after Abraham, the Israelites under Joshua drove out the Canaanites from the land. And then David, centuries after that, sort of finished off the job and drove out the Jebusites from Jerusalem and so on. And so it's maybe, possibly, that kind of reference is written from the time after Joshua or David to tell that audience that, well, okay, in our own day there's no Canaanites, but back in Abraham's day there were still Canaanites around, and just to kind of make a clarifying point to that effect. Another example, Genesis 14, verse 14, refers to the city of Dan, which is something that Abraham had contact with. The problem is, Dan was a city in northern Canaan, or northern Israel, actually. It was one of the most important cities in Israel in the far north, but it was not named Dan until the time of Joshua. In the book of Joshua and also in the book of Judges, it tells us of the story of the tribe of Dan, the Danites, migrating north and capturing that city. What was it called before they captured it? It was called Laish. So until the time of Joshua, it really was called Laish, not Dan. Genesis 14, however, centuries earlier, speaks of the city as Dan. Technically, it was not called that at that point. I think a modern example would be thinking about, for example, New York City. Thinking particularly of Manhattan, part of New York City, I suppose. We might say the Dutch settled New York City. Well, technically that's not true. It was not called New York City when the Dutch settled it. It was called by its Indian name, Manhattan. And then the Dutch took it and they changed the name to New Amsterdam. And eventually, when the English took it over, it became called New York City. And yet, we often would refer back to saying, the Dutch settled New York City. And that's kind of an anachronistic reference to something that's referred to today, even though it wasn't specifically called that then. Final example would be in Genesis 36, where it talks about the Edomite kings, again in Jacob's day, as having ruled before there was any king ruling over the Israelites. Well, there was no king in Israel, of course, until many centuries later, 1,000 years later or so, when King Saul and then King David became king. And it may be that reference also was added by someone from the time of the monarchy. All those are evidences of perhaps Moses not writing every last word of the Pentateuch. So let's kind of wrap this up, the discussion about the authorship. What do I think about the authorship of the Pentateuch? My short answer is I think Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Did he write every last word? Probably not. Maybe a modern day analogy would be books that I've written. I've written several books, and when I send them off to the publisher, I've sent them with all my words, and I think they're good words and shouldn't be tinkered with. But the editors in the publishing houses sometimes have different opinions, and they've tweaked and reworded some things that I wrote. And sometimes I push back and say, no, I really want what I actually said, or I may rewrite things. Sometimes I accept their wording, and it goes out the way they suggested it, as tweaking or revising. So, when the book is actually published, is every last word in the text of that book mine? No. There's some words that maybe an editor suggested. However, on the title page, does it list me and the editor as the co-authors of the book? No. I'm the author of the book. The editor helped contribute in minor ways. So that would be an analogy, perhaps. I think Moses was a substantial author of the Pentateuch. The great majority of the of it, and certain parts here and there he may have not written that may be written later. Finally, to reiterate, nevertheless, all of the Pentateuch is inspired by the Spirit. It is all theonoustos, it is all part of the graphe that we were talking about earlier. Okay, I want to talk now about overview, the outline of the Pentateuch, the structure of the Pentateuch. Just briefly, you have in the Pentateuch handout a very simple outline of the Pentateuch in 3 parts. The prologue being Genesis, the epilogue or recapitulation being Deuteronomy, and then the body being Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. And in the prologue, we can see a general introduction, Genesis 1 to 11, and then more specific introduction, Genesis 12 to 50. In the body, it speaks of the deliverance out of slavery in Egypt and so on. Speaks of the law, obviously, in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and all of that's there. There's narrative and legal material intertwined there, and the climax is the Exodus event. The coming out of Egypt, crossing the Red Sea, Egyptians being killed, the Passover prior to that, and all the plagues, etc., that have come. Now, in Israel's history, in later times, looking backwards, the Exodus event is the keystone event in the history of Israel. What God did for Israel at that point, that's referred back to many, many times in the centuries in the chapters that follow in the succeeding books in the Old Testament. So that really is the climax of their history. The recap is the book of Deuteronomy. By this time, the generation that came out of Egypt had died out, and the next generation was the ones that were being addressed by Moses at the end of his life. We'll talk much more about that later. The word Deuteronomy means second law, so it's kind of recapitulation, repeating many of the earlier laws. Okay, so when it's all said and done, we've talked about the title, the authorship, the outline of the Pentateuch, but what's it about? What's the content about? And lots of things we could say, of course, but to boil it down to a statement of the theme, what's the big picture in the Pentateuch? Lots have been written on that. A scholar named David Kleins wrote a book called The Theme of the Pentateuch, and I think he's expressed it as well as any, the theme, so you have it in front of you. I'm going to read it and make a comment or two. Kleins argues that, quote, the theme of the Pentateuch is the partial fulfillment, which implies also the partial non-fulfillment of the promise to or the blessing of the patriarchs. The promise or blessing is both the divine initiative in a world where human initiatives always lead to disaster and an affirmation of the primal divine intention for humanity. The promise has 3 elements: posterity, divine human relationship, and land. And that's a great summary of what I would say is the theme of the Pentateuch. Partly the partial fulfillment, which we'll talk in a week or two about the Abrahamic covenant, what God said, promised to Abraham. A lot of it was fulfilled in Abraham's own time and the centuries and decades later. But it was also there was also a non-fulfillment element to it. Part of the big promise to the patriarchs was the land of Canaan. And when the Pentateuch ends, they're not in the land. They're outside the land. So there's this both and dimension to it. And the 3 elements, posterity, divine human relationship, and land, are important. And we will again talk about this later in connection with the Abrahamic covenant. But this just is a good statement of the theme of the Pentateuch as we begin to get into it.